Proverbs 14 verse 2 declares, "He who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is perverse in his ways despises him." For centuries, this verse has been read as a moral polarity. The upright life flows from reverence for God. The crooked life expresses contempt for him. This contrast has provided interpreters across Jewish and Christian traditions with a clear lens for distinguishing fidelity from betrayal. Jewish commentators such as Rashi highlight that uprightness, yosa, is not a mere disposition but a lived honesty in one's dealings with others. To walk in uprightness is to fear God, for the fear of the Lord, yirat yuh, is the inner fountain that produces integrity in outward action. By contrast, the one who strays into perversity, los, reveals disdain, boz, for God, not in words alone but in the crookedness of life itself. The verse thus enforces the covenantal principle. True reverence is embodied in daily conduct, while deviation from the straight path signals contempt. The Church Fathers carried this into Christian moral theology. Augustine noted that uprightness is inseparable from piety. To fear God is to orient one's life toward him in humility and obedience. Gregory the Great interpreted the upright walk as simplicity and truth of heart, and perversity as duplicity and hypocrisy, signs of despising God's order. Chrysostom emphasized that reverence for the Lord is not merely a sentiment, but a shaping power of conduct visible in righteous living. Later interpreters, such as Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, and Matthew Henry, continued this trajectory. Aquinas linked uprightness to virtue as participation in divine wisdom, while Calvin stressed that integrity in one's dealings is the concrete expression of reverence for God. Henry summed up the lesson succinctly. The upright man fears God and so walks carefully. The perverse man despises God and so walks crookedly. Taken together, these readings present Proverbs 14 verse 2 as a theological axiom. Moral orientation is bound up with theological posture. Fear of God is not merely inward awe, but the animating principle of upright conduct. To forsake the straight path is not morally neutral exploration, but practical atheism, living as though God is not to be regarded. Yet here is the crucial observation. This traditional interpretation implicitly bakes negation into its worldview. The second half is read not as an alternative dynamic in its own right, but as the absence or inversion of the first. Perversity becomes not uprightness. Despising God becomes failure to fear him. The logic is binary, affirmation versus negation. Today we'll explore how the proverb can also be read in its affirmed triadic structure. Each Hebrew term, halak, walk, yashar, upright, yara, fear, los, perverse, derek, way, boz, despise, contains a triad of initiation, mediation, and realization. When read affirmatively, these yield two complementary pathways rather than mere opposites. The first triad, halak, yashar, yara, forms the path of alignment, guided embodiment, normative orientation, hierarchical reverence. This is the traditional upright way, where fear of the Lord orders conduct. The second triad, los, derek, boz, forms the path of exploration, branching, wayfinding, evaluative discernment. This is usually read as negation, but affirmatively it describes how discovery and classification themselves can become a mode of reverence. In other words, the tradition has not erred, but has leaned upon the negative pole of the system, a warning that exploration cut loose from its source hardens into contempt. Our analysis restores the affirmative pole. Exploration, when properly oriented, is not rejection of God, but another avenue into his presence. Thus, the two halves of the verse are not logically incompatible. They are the negated and affirmed expressions of the same triadic structure. Tradition rightly warns against the danger of perverse deviation. Triadic logic shows that beneath that warning lies a complementary truth. Human beings approach God either through alignment, coherence of life, or through exploration, branching discovery. Both are valid paths when affirmed, both distort when cut adrift, and together they reveal the deeper harmonic structure of the proverb. The first triad, halak, yashar, yira, forms the path of alignment-guided embodiment, normative orientation, hierarchical reverence. This is the traditional upright way, where fear of the Lord orders conduct. The second triad, los, derek, boz, forms the path of exploration, branching, wayfinding, evaluative discernment. This is usually read as negation, but affirmatively it describes how discovery and classification themselves can become a mode of reverence. In other words, the tradition has not erred, but has leaned upon the negative pole of the system, a warning that exploration cut loose from its source hardens into contempt. Our analysis restores the affirmative pole. Exploration, when properly oriented, is not rejection of God, but another avenue into his presence. Thus, the two halves of the verse are not logically incompatible. They are, the negated and affirmed expressions of the same triadic structure. Tradition rightly warns against the danger of perverse deviation, but triadic logic shows that beneath that warning lies a complementary truth. Human beings approach God either through alignment, which is the coherence of life, or through exploration, that is, branching discovery. Both are valid paths when affirmed, both distort when cut adrift, and together they reveal the deeper harmonic structure of the proverb. The first half of Proverbs 14 verse 2, "He who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord," has always been read as an affirmation. A life lived in coherence is grounded in reverence for God. Our triadic analysis confirms this reading, while also illuminating the structural dynamics by which walking, uprightness, and fear interrelate. The Hebrew halak, to walk, is more than a metaphor for daily conduct. It encodes a process whereby possibility is disclosed, guided, and embodied. The opening force of he creates an aperture for action, lamed channels that opening into a directed trajectory, and kaf provides the capacity that makes the trajectory real. What emerges is not simply the fact of walking, but the dynamic of guided embodiment, possibility becoming path, and path becoming practiced form. Tradition rightly insists that walking refers to lived conduct, but here we see why such conduct carries weight. It is the embodiment of disclosed possibility shaped into order. The term yashar, upright, sharpens this further. Tradition has always contrasted uprightness with crookedness, seeing it as honesty, integrity, and straightness of heart. Yet the structure of the word shows uprightness as a process of normative orientation. An intention is first seeded by yod, then refined and clarified by the differentiating force of shin, before finally being stabilized into a heading by resh. Uprightness, then, is not simply the absence of distortion, but the positive achievement of clarity. It is intention resolved into direction through the discipline of distinction. The emergent dynamic here is normative orientation, the steadying of life when intention is clarified, distinguished, and fixed into a clear direction. Calvin's insistence that integrity in dealings is the true mark of godly fear aligns perfectly here. Uprightness is the orientation of life that arises when intention is clarified and directed toward the good. Finally, yare, to fear, grounds the triad in reverence for God. Traditional commentators have always understood fear of the Lord as awe, humility, and recognition of divine authority. The triadic structure makes visible the way such fear functions. An impulse is awakened by yod, ordered into structured awareness by resh, and stabilized under the primacy of aleph. The emergent dynamic is hierarchical alignment. Initiative is not crushed but elevated under recognized authority. Fear of the Lord is thus not the annihilation of initiative, but its reordering under a higher primacy. Augustine and Henry were correct to stress that fear of God directs the whole of life. Our analysis clarifies the mechanism by which it does so, showing fear as the stabilizing authority that gives shape and legitimacy to human initiative. Taken together, halak yashar yare form a coupled system. Guided embodiment matures into normative orientation, and this, in turn, is stabilized through hierarchical alignment. The emergent dynamic is what we may call coherent self-governance, a life that embodies possibility, clarifies intention into direction, and constrains itself under authority. This is precisely the reality tradition has always seen in the upright walker who fears the Lord. What our analysis contributes is an account of the inner architecture of that coherence, the way disclosure becomes practice, intention becomes orientation, and reverence becomes constraint. The result is not a different teaching, but a deeper recognition of why the Proverbs' affirmation has held such enduring power. If the first triad, halak yashar yare, describes the dynamics of human alignment, the next focus, the name of God itself, anchors those dynamics in the ultimate source. Throughout Jewish and Christian tradition, the four letters YHWH have been the subject of immense reverence and reflection. Jewish commentators often stressed its ineffability, the name that is not spoken, yet that upholds all existence. Philosophers and mystics alike have linked it with the verb to be, understanding white H as the ground of being, the one who was, is, and will be. Christian theologians, from the Fathers onward, have interpreted the name as the sign of God's eternal self-existence, the Alpha and Omega, who both originates and completes. Our triadic analysis builds on these insights by treating the sequence of letters not only as a sign of being, but as a set of interacting dynamics. Rather than a static metaphysical label, the name encodes two overlapping triads, two cycles of origination, unfolding, and manifestation, that together display God as self-revealing and self-sustaining. The first triad, Yod-He-Vav, presents God as generative persistence. The Yod initiates as the seed or origin, the smallest spark of impulse. The He unfolds this impulse into expression, opening the seed into visible pattern. The Vav then links and sustains the expression across moments, joining the initial spark to its unfolding continuity. The result is a process of origination carried forward, the persistence of being that tradition has always recognized in YHWH as He who is. The second triad, He-Vav-He, presents God as relational epiphany. Here the first He opens as breath, the beginning of communication. The Vav mediates by joining and connecting, establishing relation across difference. The final He manifests as revelation, the stabilized presence that becomes perceptible. In this cycle, God is not only the eternal seed, but the one who reveals Himself as present, joining openness and manifestation in a rhythm of disclosure. These two triads overlap in the sequence He-Vav, the point where expression and connection bind the inner cycle of persistence to the outer cycle of manifestation. Out of this overlap emerges what we may call autopoietic revelation. The name signifies not only that God is, but that God is ever generating, ever revealing, ever connecting Himself to creation in a continuous loop. Here we find deep continuity with traditional interpretation. When Jewish sages insisted the name is unutterable, they pointed to its function as more than a word, an active reality that grounds all being. When Christian commentators associated Yahweh with Christ as the Logos, they intuited the same dynamics of origination, expression, and relation. Our analysis does not replace these insights, but articulates the structural logic by which the name accomplishes what tradition has long proclaimed. God is the source who both sustains Himself and discloses Himself. Thus, the divine name triads place human alignment, Halak Yashar Yari, within a wider frame. Alignment finds its ground not in arbitrary morality, but in the self-generating, self-revealing activity of God. The walker's coherence mirrors divine persistence. The upright person's orientation echoes divine expression. The fear of the Lord resonates with divine manifestation. Tradition has always held that reverence for God orders human life. The triadic reading makes this resonance visible, showing the name itself as the structural archetype of the dynamics into which human alignment is drawn. The second colon of Proverbs 14 verse 2 is traditionally read in a negated key. The one who is perverse in his ways despises the Lord. Our aim is not to deny the warning implicit in that reading, but to recover the affirmed structure latent in the same roots. In the logic of triads, what appears as a simple moral antithesis can also be seen as a complementary pathway. The first half of the verse, Halak Yashar Yari, articulates alignment. The second, taken affirmatively, articulates exploration. Alignment and exploration are not enemies. They are paired modes by which life may move toward God, provided both remain tethered to the divine dynamism disclosed in the name Yahweh. When that tether is cut, exploration decays into precisely the crookedness and contempt that tradition rightly warns against. Read this way: the negative inheritance of conventional exegesis functions as a guardrail, while the triadic reading restores the positive vocation of exploration as a mode of reverence. The root laws, to deviate or to turn aside, is commonly rendered perverse, yet its triadic structure reveals something more fundamental: the branching impulse of a living system. Each letter enacts part of that branching lame, bends the trajectory outward, opening a departure from the settled frame. Vav tests and secures relational links along that departure. Zayin cuts a boundary, fixing the departure into a defined local domain. This is the process we may name branch formation. It is not inherently rebellion, though it may become so if links and boundaries fail. Instead, it is the beginning of discovery under God. Tradition was correct to guard against a crooked turning that isolates itself in self-will, but affirmed as a triad, Laws describes the disciplined deviation by which life honors divine plenitude, acknowledging that God's world is capacious enough to sustain more than one legitimate path. The root derek, to tread or to make a way, carries this branching motion into sustained movement. Its triadic pattern shows how Dalet marks a threshold, the decisive crossing into new terrain. Resh supplies orientation, bearings and direction once inside that space. Kaf manifests realization, equipping the path with concrete capacity. When taken together, this process becomes path instantiation. It is the moment where exploration ceases to be a tentative departure and becomes a lived way. The tradition rightly recognized derek as conduct or manner of life, and the triadic view makes visible why. Thresholds commit the system, orientations keep it true, and realizations test its feasibility. Exploration at this stage must remain tethered to alignment and to the divine name. Without thresholds accountable to reverence, orientation corrigible under divine awareness, and realizations subordinated to worship rather than performance, the path collapses into mere wandering. But when these conditions hold, derek turns reverence into a road, an instantiation of the fear of the Lord in circumstances where no path previously existed. The root bos, to despise, has fueled centuries of negative readings, but its triadic logic reveals an equally important affirmative: valuation. The letters show how this works. Bet frames and contains the new material so it may be held in view. Vav relates that material to what already has meaning. Zayin distinguishes, ranking what is weighty from what is trivial, what is worthy from what is unworthy. Together they form valuative taxonomy, the ordering of discovery into a usable map. When any part of this triad collapses, if framing becomes rigid, relation overly lax, or distinction cuts without reference, the process curdles into contempt, despising not through ordered love, but through severance from God. Yet when held in balance, Boz becomes an act of reverence, despising only what is unworthy of the Lord and elevating what coheres with his life. This harmonizes with wisdom tradition, where the righteous hate evil precisely because they love the good. In this way, discernment becomes doxology rather than disdain. Taken together, Los Derek Boz articulate the larger emergent process of operational cartography. The system explores, routes, and codifies new domains. Branch formation initiates disciplined departures. Path instantiation transforms potential into livable practice. Valuative taxonomy orders the gains so they may guide future action. Exploration in this triadic sense is not a rival to alignment, but its complement. The calibration between them is essential. Alignment prevents exploration from collapsing into novelty without anchor, while exploration prevents alignment from hardening into rigidity without renewal. In lived terms, alignment guarantees fidelity to what God has already disclosed, while exploration remains docile to further disclosure, seeking how that same fear of the Lord takes form at new thresholds, along new routes, and within freshly bounded domains. The pattern of exploration cannot stand on its own. As we will soon see, it remains affirmed only when threaded through the life of the divine name. The overlap of expression and relation, Hivav, keeps departures from isolation, directs thresholds toward reverence, and orients valuation towards manifestation rather than self-assertion. Exploration becomes faithful discovery only when its branching, path-making, and discerning are continually drawn into God's generative persistence and relational openness. In this light, the traditional warning about perversity and contempt is not discarded but clarified. It shows what happens when exploration loses its mooring in the source. Deviation drifts into willfulness, paths collapse into expediency, and valuation curdles into scorn. The triadic reading preserves that severity, yet also restores the possibility hidden in the same verbs. Exploration as a reverent practice of branching with discipline, instantiating with orientation, and valuing with ordered love. When we draw together the three sets of dynamics, the human path of alignment, the divine dynamism of the source, and the human path of exploration, we can see how they form a single living system. Each has its own integrity, but none makes sense in isolation. Alignment gives coherence and stability to human life. The source is the wellspring of being and revelation. Exploration extends life into new domains. Proverbs 14 verse 2, when read through this lens, becomes a compressed statement of how these three interact. The source enables alignment. Human coherence is not self-generated. When we speak of walking uprightly, clarifying intention into direction, and bringing impulses under reverent authority, these are not autonomous achievements. They are possible because God continually generates, expresses, connects, and manifests himself. His self-revealing persistence supplies both the ontological ground, the fact that reality itself holds together, and the informational ground, the meaningful structures by which reality can be navigated. This is why the tradition has always insisted that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Alignment is not just good habit, it is the human echo of God's own generativity. Without that provision from the source, alignment could not stabilize into coherent self-governance. The source also permits exploration. The same divine life that makes alignment possible also makes exploration possible. Because God is inexhaustibly self-revealing, the world is never closed. There is always more to discover, more paths to instantiate, more values to discern. The very dynamism of the name, origination, expression, relation, manifestation, creates a field in which branching and testing are not merely tolerated, but invited. Traditional interpreters, wary of the dangers of deviation, have usually stressed the negative pole, turning aside as perversity. Our reading does not deny that risk, but adds an affirmed dimension. To turn aside may also mean to venture into fresh ground, crossing thresholds that God himself has opened, orienting within new contexts, embodying capacities in new ways. Exploration becomes reverence in action when it remains tethered to the divine self-disclosure. The source grants not only the law of uprightness, but the space in which new paths of obedience can be formed. Alignment and exploration are not rivals but partners. Each requires the other. Alignment keeps exploration from drifting into arrogance or contempt. Exploration keeps alignment from congealing into rigidity or rote repetition. If life is only aligned, it risks becoming brittle, faithful in form but unresponsive to God's fresh disclosures. If life is only exploratory, it risks becoming chaotic, novel in form but unanchored in God's authority. Together they form a calibration loop. Alignment provides coherence and principled constraint. Exploration provides adaptability and renewal, and each continually corrects and balances the other. This is how reverence remains both the beginning and the ongoing method of wisdom. Never static, never unmoored. When these three, source, alignment, and exploration, are seen in their relationships, a new emergent reality comes into view. Life becomes what we might call harmonic participation. Human beings live stably yet adaptively, grounded in God's generative persistence, ordered through coherent practice and extended through faithful discovery. Upright walking is preserved, but so is disciplined branching. Reverence remains the anchor, while discovery becomes an instrument of praise. Here, the traditional warning retains its force. When exploration cuts itself loose from the source and refuses the discipline of alignment, the triad collapses into its negated form. Branching becomes wayward deviation, path-making becomes opportunistic self-indulgence, valuation curdles into contempt. This is the perversity and despising of God that Jewish and Christian interpreters have rightly emphasized for centuries. But the triadic analysis shows that this is not the only possibility encoded in the verse. When exploration remains provisioned by God's self-revelation and calibrated by alignment, it becomes another affirmed path into reverence. In this light, Proverbs 14 verse 2 is not simply a binary opposition between the godly and the ungodly. It is also a compact picture of the whole system of human participation in God's self-disclosure. One path approaches through coherence of life, another through reverent discovery. Both are real, both are necessary, and together they form the living harmony of a people who walk, orient, fear, branch, instantiate, and discern, all under the ever-generative, ever-revealing name. In the end, Proverbs 14 verse 2 is revealed not as a contrast of virtue and vice, but a revelation of how wisdom itself works. Beneath its two short lines lies a living triad, the way of alignment, the inexhaustible source, and the way of exploration. Alignment steadies us, our walk embodied, our intentions clarified, our reverence ordered under God. The name discloses the source, ever-generating, ever-revealing, the ground on which all fidelity stands. Exploration extends us, branching into new territory, testing new paths, discerning with reverence what is worthy of God. Tradition is right to warn us, when exploration abandons its tether, it hardens into arrogance and contempt. But triadic wisdom also shows us the brighter truth. When exploration remains calibrated by alignment and rooted in the source, it becomes another form of worship. Discovery itself can be reverence. Thresholds can be crossed in awe. Valuations can become acts of praise. And here is the invitation. The proverb is not simply telling us to choose one way over another. It is summoning us to hold both in harmony. Walk uprightly, yes, but also venture faithfully. Anchor your life in coherence, but do not fear the branching paths God may open. Let alignment guard you from drift, and let exploration keep you from stagnation. Together they form a wisdom that is stable without rigidity and daring without contempt. This is wisdom we can live today, to shape our lives as harmonic participation in God's ever-generative, ever-revealing presence. To walk with integrity and to explore with reverence. To order our steps in fidelity and to discover new thresholds of faith. Proverbs 14 verse 2, read in its full triadic depth, is not a warning alone. It is an invitation to a life that is coherent, adaptive, reverent, and alive to possibility. It asks us not only to fear the Lord, but to find in that reverence the courage to walk, to branch, and to discern, ever in step with the one who is and who reveals himself.